Hey guys, tonight we begin with cold, not the dramatic, movie kind of cold with wolves howling and cloaks billowing in slow motion. This is the quiet, boring, soul-flattening cold, the kind that creeps into your bones while you're retrying to sleep and politely refuses to leave until April. So dim the lights, let your shoulders drop. If you're wearing socks, keep them on. Medieval people would be jealous, and as you settle in, we're going to gently drift back to a time when winter was not a season. It was a long, personal insult. Medieval families did not brace for winter. They endured it. Slowly. Uncomfortably. Often while pretending this was normal and definitely what God intended. There were no cozy marketing campaigns about hype. No pumpkin-spiced anything. Just darkness, dampness, and the constant low-level anxiety that your house, your food, or your own toes might simply give up. So let's ease into it. No rush. Winter always had plenty of time. In a medieval village, winter announced itself early. The days shortened. The light faded. Fields that had been busy with harvest just weeks before now sat brown and tired, like they were also done with the year. Families knew what was coming. They always did. And yet, every winter still felt like a surprise. Because no matter how much grain you stored, or how carefully you salted the meat, winter always found a way to feel longer than expected. The medieval house was not what we would call sealed. It was more of a suggestion of shelter. Wooden beams, wattle and daub walls, gaps everywhere. The wind didn't knock. It simply wandered in, explored the interior, and made itself comfortable. If you were wealthy, you might have stone walls, which sounds impressive until you realize stone is excellent at holding cold. Stone doesn't care about your comfort. Stone remembers glaciers. Most families lived in a single room, one room for cooking, eating, working, sleeping, existing. Privacy was not a concept. Personal space was something monks maybe talked about. Everyone slept together. Parents, children, sometimes grandparents, sometimes animals. Not because it was charming, but because bodies were warm, and warmth was a group project. Beds, when they existed, were shared. And bed is doing a lot of work here. It might be a wooden frame. It might be a pile of straw. The straw was supposed to be changed regularly. It often was not. Over time, it became compacted, lumpy, a kind of organic mattress that remembered every winter you'd ever suffered through. Blankets were heavy, scratchy, and precious. Wool was keen linen, existed but was less insulated. If you had multiple blankets, you were doing well. If you had furs, you were doing very well. Or possibly a noble who still complained constantly, and everyone complained. Quietly. Complaining loudly burned energy. At night, the fire was allowed to die down. Firewood was too valuable to waste while everyone slept. You might bang the embers, covering them with ash, hoping they would survive until morning. Sometimes they did. Sometimes you woke up to a dead hearth, and the special disappointment that came with it. The cold at night was different. It settled. It pressed. Breath became visible, hanging in the air like a reminder that you were, in fact, alive and should probably stay that way. Children slept sandwiched between adults. Babies were wrapped tightly. Elderly relatives were given the warmest spot, usually closest to the remaining heat of the hearth, because losing a grandparent to winter was both sad and inconvenient. Clothing was worn to bed. Everything you owned that could be layered was layered. Tunics, hose, cloaks, hats. Sleeping naked was not romantic. It was reckless and cold. Extremely cold. Now, let's gently shift our focus from the peasants, who suffered honestly, to the nobles, who suffered expensively. Castles were not warm. This surprises people. They imagine roaring fires and thick walls. But castles were enormous, drafty, and full of stone. Wind moved through corridors like it had business there. Tapestries were hung not just for decoration, but as insulation. Big, heavy, Wall hangings helped trap heat and block drafts. This was medieval interior design, driven entirely by survival. Nobles slept in large beds with curtains. These weren't for privacy, although that was a bonus. They were to keep warmth in. A bed with curtains was basically a fabric tent, trapping body heat inside. If you were important, you slept in a smaller space inside a larger, colder room. Very efficient. Even kings complained about the cold. Especially kings. They wrote letters about it. They blamed their ailments on it, which was sometimes fair. Joint pain, respiratory issues, lingering coughs that never quite left. Winter was a slow health tax that everyone paid. Food in winter was repetitive. Fresh vegetables were gone. Fruit was a memory. Meals revolved around grains, dried legumes, salted meat, and whatever had survived storage. Bread was constant. Dark, dense bread. Soup was common. Stews that simmered for hours, partly for flavor. Mostly because hot liquid was comforting and made you feel like you were doing something about the cold. Spices, if you had them, were used generously. Not because medieval people had bad taste, but because spices created the illusion of warmth. Pepper, cloves, cinnamon. They reminded you that somewhere in the world, the sun still existed. Alcohol played its role. Ale was safer than water. Wine was, for those who could afford it. It warmed you briefly, lied to you about your internal temperature, and then left you colder later. But by then, you were asleep. Or at least trying to be. Let's float gently over to the children. Medieval winters were especially hard on kids. Their bodies were smaller, they lost heat faster. Infant mortality spiked in winter months. Families knew this. They didn't talk about it much. You loved your children. You protected them. You also accepted that winter might take some of them anyway. Children slept close. They were wrapped, tucked, pressed against parents or siblings. Older children learned early how to help fetching, carrying water before it froze. Watching younger siblings. Winter made everyone useful. Play didn't stop, but it changed. Snow is both fun and dangerous. Frostbite was not called frostbite. It was just something that happened to fingers and toes, and sometimes. Yes, children learned quickly when to come inside, because pain was an effective teacher. Now let's slide quietly into the emotional side of winter. Winter was long. Nights were very long. With limited light, people went to bed early, not because they were tired, but because there was nothing else to do. Candles were expensive. Oil was precious. Darkness became routine. This led to what we might now call seasonal depression, except no one had a word for it. They just felt heavy, slow, irritable. Prayers increased. Superstitions flourished. The line between physical cold and spiritual cold blurred. Stories were told at night, not dramatic ones. Familiarones, repeated ones, because repetition was soothing. You already knew how it ended. That mattered. For the elite, winter brought isolation. Travel was difficult. Roads were muddy or frozen. Courts shrank social. Life slowed. Letters took longer. News arrived stale. This is where we start to see the emotional unraveling of certain nobles, trapped in cold castles with their thoughts and their relatives, and we'll get to them. Slowly. Very slowly. But before we leave chapter 1, let's sit for a moment with the basic truth of medieval winter survival. It wasn't heroic. It wasn't adventurous. It was patient. It was communal. It was deeply unglamorous. People survived by sharing heat, sharing food, sharing space, by lowering expectations, by understanding that comfort was seasonal, and winter was not the season for it. Chapter 2. The season of cuffing winter did not arrive alone. It brought friends. They were subtle at first, a cough that lingered, a sniffle that never quite went away, a heaviness in the chest that people pretended was nothing. Medieval families did not talk about illness as something separate from winter. Sickness was just part of the package, like darkness or cold feet. Once the temperature dropped, bodies stiffened. Joints ached. Old injuries reintroduced themselves, politely but persistently. A badly healed bone from a harvest accident years earlier would suddenly become very interested in the weather. People noticed these things. They blamed the cold. They were usually right. Homes filled with smoke in winter. Fires burned constantly during the day, especially for cooking. Chimneys existed, but they were inefficient. Smoke hung in the air, soaking into clothes, hair, lungs. Children grew up breathing it. Elderly relatives coughed through the night. Everyone accepted this as normal, because there was no alternative. Warmth came at the price of breathable air. Respiratory illness was common. Very common. Chronic coughs were so widespread that they barely registered as illness anymore. It was just what happened to people who lived long enough. In winter, the cough steepened, became wetter, louder, more concerning. But concern rarely changed outcomes. Doctors, when consulted, offered advice that ranged from mildly helpful to impressively useless. Balance the humors. Avoid cold winds. Eat warming foods. Sleep well, which was adorable advice, considering everyone was cold. The wind lived inside the house, and sleep involved shivering on straw. Herbal remedies were common. Honey, garlic, onion poultices, warm ale mixed with herbs. These sometimes helped, sometimes they didn't, but they gave the impression of action, which mattered. For children, winter sickness could turn fast. A fever that started mild could burn through a small body in days. Families watched closely. They prayed. They bundled. They waited. Sometimes the child recovered, sometimes they didn't. And then winter moved on without acknowledging it had taken anything. Now let's shift, slowly, to hunger. Winter food was calculated carefully in autumn. Grain was measured. Meat was salted or smoked. Root vegetables were stored in cellars or pits. This worked, mostly. But winter was long, and storage was imperfect. Mold happened. Rats happened. Sometimes entire barrels were lost. Bilate winter, hunger became sharper. Not starvation, necessarily, just constant undernourishment. Meals shrank. Bread became thinner. Soup became more watery. People noticed their belts tightening in the wrong direction. Children were fed first. Always. Adults went without quietly, especially mothers. Especially grandmothers. Hunger was managed socially. No speeches, no drama, just less food on certain plates. The cold made hunger worse. Bodies burned more energy just staying warm. People felt tired all the time. Movement slowed. Work continued, because it had to, but at a reduced pace. Winter was the season of endurance, not productivity. Let's drift now into the emotional weight of all this. Winter isolation did strange things to people. With fewer distractions, small problems grew large. Family tensions sharpened. Old arguments resurfaced. There was nowhere to go. No fields to escape to. No neighbors to visit. In peasant homes, everyone was trapped together. This led to cooperation, but also irritation. Children argued. Adults snapped more quickly. Silence became heavy. Stories helped. So did routine. Doing the same things every day gave winter a shape. For nobles, winter was quieter but not calmer. Courts shrank, entertainments dwindled. Hunting was limited. Travel was risky. Nobles spent long weeks indoors, surrounded by servants and relatives they did not choose. This is where we start to see winter melancholy among the elite. Letters from nobles frequently mentioned boredom, discomfort, and illness. Complaints about cold rooms, about damp bedding, about endless nights. Imagine being fabulously wealthy and still unable to feel your toes. Kings held court wrapped in furs. Queens layered gowns. Gloves were worn indoors. Crowns were cold. Literally cold. Metal does not care about royal authority. Sleeping arrangements among nobles were more elaborate, but not necessarily more comfortable. Large beds with many layers of bedding, feather mattresses, if you were lucky. Hot bricks wrapped in cloth were placed near feet. Sometimes they worked. Sometimes they cooled quickly and became just another cold object in the bed. Now let's quietly introduce another winter companion. Fear. Not the dramatic kind, the slow kind. Fear of running out. Fear of sickness. Fear that this winter might be the one that breaks you. People didn't talk about it openly. They prayed instead, or distracted themselves. Religion took on extra weight in winter. Churches were cold too, by the way, but they were places of gathering, of light. Candles burned there more freely than in homes. Services offered structure, hope, explanations. Winter holidays mattered deeply, not for joy, exactly, for interruption, for marking time. Feasts like Christmas were not just celebrations. They were psychological milestones, proof that winter was moving forward, even if it didn't feel like Italiano. Children remembered these moments vividly. Extra food, sweet things, laughter. For a day or two, winter loosened its grip. Then it returned, unimpressed. Now let's talk briefly about sleep. Or rather, the struggle to sleep. Medieval sleep was not one long stretch. People often slept in two phases. First, sleep, and second, sleep. Waking in between was normal. In winter, this pattern became more pronounced. People woke due to cold, due to coughing, due to discomfort. During these waking periods, some prayed, some talked quietly, some tended the fire if it was still alive. Others just lay there, waiting to feel warm again. Insomnia was not diagnosed. It was endured. It was endured. Animals inside the house helped. Cows, sheep, chickens. Their body heat mattered. The smell was unfortunate but tolerated. Winter lowered standards. Let's float gently toward the end of winter. Late winter was the hardest. Food was lowest. Bodies were weakest. Spirits were thin. The cold had lost its novelty and gained only resentment. This was when people died quietly, elderly relatives slipping away, infants failing to recover. No drama, just absence. Justa, spring was anticipated with something close to desperation. Signs were watched closely. Thawing ground, longer, light, the sound of water moving again. These were noticed, celebrated internally. But winter did not leave all at once. It lingered. Cold nights persisted. Snow returned unexpectedly. People learned not to trust early warmth. And through it all, medieval families survived, not through ingenuity, but through patience, through closeness, through enduring things together without naming them as extraordinary. Chapter 3. Children of winter. Medieval children did not remember a time before cold. Winter arrived early in life and stayed long enough to become familiar. By the time a child could walk, they already understood where the warm spots in the house were. Near the hearth, near other people, near animals. Warmth was not abstract. It was a location. Childhood illnesses often began in winter. Coughs, fevers, weakness that lingered into spring. Parents watched carefully, but there was only so much they could do. Bundling was constant. Layers were added and removed throughout the day like a quiet ritual. Hats stayed on indoors. Feet were wrapped. Hands were rubbed to bring color back. Infants were kept close to the mother, or another warm adult. Cradless existed, but during the coldest nights, babies were often brought into bed. This was practical, not sentimental. Heat mattered more than safety guidelines that would be invented centuries later. Children learned early how to be useful in winter, carrying kindling, watching embers turning grain, feeding animals. Even very young children had tasks, not because parents were cruel, but because winter demanded contribution. Idleness felt dangerous. Games continued, but they were quieter. Indoors, children played with simple objects. Beats of wood, cloth dolls, stones, Outdoors, snow was tempting, but risky. Wet clothes were a problem. Once soaked, they stayed soaked. Drying took time and fuel. Children learned caution through discomfort. For peasant children, winter meant hunger in a slow, manageable way. Their portions shrank. They noticed. They didn't complain. Hunger was normalized early. Parents framed it gently. We eat less now, so we can eat later. This explanation worked often enough. For noble children, winter was different, but not easier. Royal and aristocratic children grew up in cold stone castles. Nurseries existed, but they were still drafty. Fires burned, but heat rarely reached corners. Servants hovered constantly, adjusting layers, bringing warm drinks, fussing endlessly. Despite this attention, noble children were often sickly. In fact, especially sickly. Poor ventilation, damp walls, smoke, all contributed. Many royal children developed chronic illnesses early. Weak lungs, joint pain, fragile constitutions that would later be described politely in portraits. These children were wrapped in expensive fabrics, silk, velvet, fur. None of it stopped the cold entirely. Metal toys were cold to the touch. Stone floors chilled small feet quickly. Education continued through winter. Tutors arrived bundled and grumpy. Lessons were held near fireplaces when possible. Children learned Latin while shivering slightly, because comfort was not prioritized over instruction. Now let's talk about emotional cold. Winter shaped medieval parenting in subtle ways. Affection existed, but it was practical. Warmth was shown through action, through covering, through feeding, through keeping children alive. Emotional expression was quieter. Parents did not expect childhood to be joyful. They expected it to be survived. Winter reinforced this mindset. A child who made it through several winters was considered sturdy, promising, worth investing in further. Among nobles, winter births were especially fraught. Babies born in cold months faced higher risks. Mothers weakened by pregnancy struggled more. Infant mortality was high. Royal families tracked these losses carefully, because heirs mattered. But even kings could not bargain with winter. Some children became symbols of hope. A surviving winter baby was praised, named after saints, wrapped in superstition. Others became symbols of fragility, watched constantly, protected excessively, sometimes smothered by attention. Let's drift now toward adolescence. Teenagers felt winter differently. Bodies changed. Growth demanded energy that winter food could barely provide. Many adolescents grew thin, tall and narrow. Pale, cold, intensified everything. Mood swings, restlessness, irritability. For noble adolescents, winter meant confinement. Training continued. Manners were drilled. Future roles were emphasized. Marriages were discussed, sometimes arranged. Winter was when plans were made, because there was time to sit and think too much time. This is when dynastic anxiety took root. Who would marry whom? Who was healthy enough? Who looked sickly in candlelight? Winter made flaws more visible. Now let's quietly introduce winter discipline. Punishments did not pause for cold. Children still worked, still obeyed, still learned consequences. Winter made punishment harsher by default. Standing still was colder than moving. Missing the meal mattered more. Parents and guardians did not enjoy this, but winter hardened expectations. Softness felt dangerous, and yet, winter also brought closeness. Long nights meant stories. Oral tradition thrived. Children learned family histories, legends, warnings. These were not exciting tales. They were familiar, reassuring. They reminded children that others had survived winters before them. Bedtime came early. Children slept hard, exhausted, curled into shared spaces. Dreams were probably cold too. Let's gently move toward spring again, through a child's eyes. Spring felt miraculous. Light returned food, improved. Bodies woke up. Children ran more, laughed more. Parents relaxed slightly. Winter loosened its grip, and childhood expanded again. But winter always returned, and each return shaped the child a little more. Taught patience, taught endurance, taught that comfort was temporary. These lessons followed children into adulthood, into marriages, into parenthood, into their own winters. Chapter 4. Cold marriages and shared blankets. Winter had a way of exposing marriages, not dramatically, just slowly, through proximity. Medieval couples did not go on long walks or escape two separate rooms when they were irritated. Winter pressed them together, literally. Shared beds, shared meals, shared silence. Marriage in the medieval world was rarely about warmth in the emotional sense. It was about alliance, labor, heirs, and survival. Winter tested all of that. A marriage that worked in summer fields sometimes struggled in winter rooms. Peasant couples worked as units. In winter, their labor shifted indoors. Repairing tools, spinning wool, mending clothes. They sat close because light and heat were centralized. Conversation happened, whether you wanted it to or not. So did conflict. Arguments were quieter in winter. Raised voices burned energy and attracted attention from children and neighbors. Disputes became sharp whispers. Long silences, passive cooperation. Winter did not allow dramatic exits. Affection, when it appeared, was practical. Sharing the warmest spot, offering the last piece of bread, pulling a blanket closer. Love looked like resource management. For noble marriages, winter was even more revealing. Noble couples often lived apart during warmer months. Separate estates, separate routines. Winter brought them under one roof, sometimes reluctantly. Castles filled with servants, but privacy was limited. Even emotional distance was hard to maintain when everyone was cold. Letters from noble spouses in winter are revealing. Complaints about drafts, about illness, about each other. Husbands blamed wives for poor household management. Wives blamed husbands for refusing to spend money on better tapestries. Everyone blamed the cold. Royal marriages were particularly strained. Kings and queens slept in large beds surrounded by ceremony. But the cold crept in anyway. Conjugal duties did not pause for winter. Heirs were expected year-round. This led to deeply uncomfortable situations involving cold sheets, cold bodies, and very determined advisors. Queens often faced winter pregnancies. These were dangerous. Cold weakened the body. Nutrition suffered. Childbirth in winter carried higher risks. And yet, dynastic pressure did not ease. Some royal couples grew closer in winter. Shared discomfort created bonding. Others grew resentful. Winter made flaws impossible to ignore. A bad temper, a weak constitution, an irritating habit magnified by confinement. More often than not, the first voyages of the spring were about seeing who else had survived the winter. It was a period of tentative re-engagement, which is a fancy way of saying they sailed to the next trading post to see if their neighbors were still alive or if they had any grain left to swap for some very old, very salty fish. These early spring markets, like the one at Hidabi or Kupang, were less like bustling bazaars and more like a collection of very cold, very damp people standing in the mud, trying to remember how to socialize. The irony of these encounters was that everyone was essentially in the same state of physical ruin. You'd have a group of Norse traders arriving from the west, and a group of Swedish merchants coming from the east, and both sides would spend the first hour just blinking at each other through bloodshot eyes and coughing in unison. The trade was often a slow, sluggish affair. They'd lay out their wereswaller's tusks, bundles of furs that had definitely seen better days, and perhaps some intricate bone carvings made during those long January nights. There was no haggling with high energy. It was more of a mutual agreement that everything was a bit miserable, and a trade of some dried seal meat for a bag of questionable barley was probably the best anyone could hope for. Communication was another hurdle. After months of speaking only to your immediate family and your cow, the art of conversation had mostly withered away. The Vikings used a common tongue, Old Norse, but regional dialects had a way of drifting over the winter. You might find that your cousins from across the mountain now sounded like they were talking with a mouthful of pebbles. So, they relied on silent trade or the universal language of pointing at things and grunting until someone nodded. It was a slow, rhythmic process of re-establishing the world. They would sit around small, outdoor fires. 'Cause nobody wanted to be inside another smoky room armchair news of who had died of the winter cough, and whose roof had collapsed under the March snow. Let's float over to the concept of guest friendship during this time. There was a very strict social code in the north called Havamel, which gave instructions on how to treat a guest. It basically said that if a traveler shows up at your door, you have to give them a seat, a fire, and some dry clothes. Mostly, because if you didn't, they'd probably die on your doorstep, and then you'd have to deal with their ghost. During these first spring voyages, this hospitality was stretched to its limit. You'd have dozens of sailors appearing at a farmstead, all of them wet, all of them hungry, and all of them smelling like the inside of a whale. You'd welcome them in, offer them the last of your fermented ale, and listen to their stories until you both fell asleep sitting up. It was a communal survival strategy, a way of knitting the fractured world back together after the long, dark isolation. As the sun climbed higher and the trading posts began to empty, the ships would finally turn toward the open sea. The boring part of the year, the sitting, the carving, the waiting was over, replaced by the equally repetitive, but much saltier boredom of the ocean. But for a brief moment in the mud of the spring markets, the Viking world was a place of quiet, weary reconnect. They had endured the Arctic night, not with a roar, but with a slow, steady pulse. And as we leave them there, rowing toward a horizon that finally stays bright past dinner time, we can finally let the weight of their long winter settle over us, too. Chapter 11. The genetic masterpiece of the Habsburg jaw. Now that we've left the damp, smoky longhouses of the north, let's float south both in geography and in genetic stability. We're moving into the gilded, suffocating palaces of the Habsburgs, a family that took the idea of keeping it in the family and turned it into a multi-century endurance sport. While the Vikings were struggling to survive the cold, the Habsburgs were struggling to survive their own family reunions. You see, the Habsburgs didn't really believe in conquering through war when they could simply marry their cousins and inherit a kingdom. Their motto was basically, let others wage war. You, happy Austria, marry. It worked brilliantly for their landholdings, but it was a bit of a disaster for their skeletons. If you've ever looked at a portrait of a late-period Spanish Habsburg and thought they looked like a thumb that had been sat on by a very heavy horse, you aren't alone. The most famous feature of this dynasty was the Habsburg jaw, or prognathism, because they kept marrying their own relatives to ensure no outside blood took their land. They effectively created a genetic feedback loop. By the time we get to the 17th century, the family tree wasn't so much a tree as it was a very tangled, very confused bush. This resulted in a lower jaw that didn't just protrude, it practically led the way into the room. It made eating difficult, speaking a challenge, and looking dignified nearly impossible. The poster child for this biological doubling down was Charles II of Spain. Now, Charles was a man who, quite frankly, shouldn't have been able to function, let alone rule an empire. Because why not have a king whose family tree was so narrow it was practically a flagpole? His coefficient of inbreeding was actually higher than that of a child, born to 2 siblings. It was Cayed the Bewitched, but in reality, it was just the victim of 2 centuries of very poor marital choices. He didn't speak until he was 4, didn't walk until he was 8, and his jaw was so oversized that his top and bottom teeth didn't meet. This meant he couldn't chew his food properly, leading to a lifetime of chronic indigestion and a generally grumpy disposition. One can only imagine the royal dinners, with the most powerful man in the world, struggling to navigate a piece of boiled mutton. The irony here is that the Habsburgs were obsessed with their pure blood. They believed they were the pinnacle of European nobility, yet they were physically falling apart. Charles was often described as having a head that was too big for his body, and a tongue that was too big for his mouth. He drooled constantly, which the court painters tried their best to ignore. But there's only so much a soft focus brush can do for a man who looks like he's made of melting wax. He was married twice, mostly for political reasons. But since he was also chronically ill and genetically exhausted, he failed to produce an heir. This eventually led to the War of the Spanish Succession, because when a dynasty spends 300 years trying to keep its blood pure, it eventually runs out of blood altogether. Chapter 12. The daily grind of a broken king, living as Charles II, was a slow-motion tragedy of royal proportions. His daily life was a series of rituals designed to keep his fragile body from simply giving up. Because he was so weak, he spent most of his time being carried around the Escorial, a massive, gloomy palace monastery outside Madrid that felt more like a tomb than a residence. The walls were lined with portraits of his ancestors, all of whom shared his distinctive chin, staring down at him as if to say, "Yes, we did this to you, and we'd do it again for a piece of the Netherlands." His medical treatments were, as you might expect, less than helpful. The doctors of the time, convinced he was under a curse rather than a victim of a recessive gene, tried everything from holy water to placing the freshly slaughtered organs of animals on his chest to draw out the evil. It was a world of superstition and smells. Imagine being a man who already has trouble breathing because of his jaw, and now you have a warm pigeon heart taped to your ribs. It wasn't exactly a recipe for a restful afternoon. He spent his days in a state of perpetual half-bakedness, moving from one religious ceremony to another, his heavy velvet robes weighing down a body that was already struggling to stand. The court around him was equally stagnant. Because the king was so incapacitated, the real power lay with his mother, Mariana of Austria, who, coincidentally, was also his niece. The social dynamics were a nightmare of etiquette. There was a rule for everything. How many steps you could take toward the king, which hand you used to offer him a cup of water, and how long you had to wait after he drooled before you could politely look away. It was a silent, slow-moving world where nothing ever really changed. And the atmosphere was thick with the scent of incense and the sound of distant chanting. Let's float over to his hobbies, if you can call them that. Charles was fond of shooting, but since he could barely hold a musket, he mostly just watched others do it. He also had a strange obsession with their royal tombs. He would occasionally descend into the pantheon of the kings and of the coffins of his ancestors, opened so he could look at their remains. It was a morbid, quiet pastime of man. It was the end of his line staring at the beginning of it, perhaps wondering which one of them had passed down the gene that made it so hard for him to swallow his dinner. It was a life of quiet, gilded despair, a long, slow walk toward an inevitable extinction. Chapter 13. The golden age of the Habsburg chin. As we drift further into the history of the Habsburgs, we have to talk about the peak of their facial architecture. You see, the jaw wasn't just a biological accident to them. It became a sort of accidental trademark, like a living family crest that you couldn't put down. In the mid-16th century, Emperor Charles V was the man who really put the Habsburg in the Habsburg jaw. He was the most powerful ruler in Europe, presiding over an empire where the sun never set. Yet he spent a significant portion of his life struggling to close his mouth. He had a lower jaw that didn't just protrude. It seemed to be attempting an escape from the rest of his face. It's said that when he traveled through Spain for the first time, a peasant shouted at him, "Your Majesty, shut your mouth. The flies of this country are very insolent." This is the kind of casual, rural honesty you can only get in the 1500s. Charles, to his credit, took it with a sort of weary, noble silence mostly, because his teeth didn't meet, making a witty retort a bit of a phonetic nightmare. The irony of the situation was palpable. Here was a man who owned half the known world, yet he couldn't chew a crust of bread without significant mechanical effort. The lifestyle of these elite genetic experiments was one of extreme, sluggish formality. Because their bodies were often failing them, the Habsburgs leaned heavily into the Spanish court ceremony. This was a system of etiquette so rigid it makes a modern DMV look like a rave. Every single movement was choreographed. If the king wanted a glass of water, it had to be brought by a specific nobleman, who handed it to another nobleman, who then knelt for several minutes before finally offering it to the king. By the time the water reached the royal lip switch, again, we're often a bit of a moving target, it was probably room temperature and flavored with the dust of the palace. It was a world of slow-motion histories, where the ticking of a clock was the loudest thing in the room. Chapter 14. The melancholy of the royal nursery. If we float over to the royal nurseries, the scene becomes even more subdued. The Habsburg children were the primary victims of this dynastic stubbornness. Because they were so fragile, they weren't allowed to play like normal children. They were treated like expensive glass figurines. A young Habsburg prince or princess spent their days swaddled in heavy silk and lace, surrounded by somber tutors and stern governesses who were terrified the child might catch a draft and end the family line. They were fed a diet of soft mushies not just because they were children, but because the family's dental situation made anything crunchy a genuine hazard. There was a profound, quiet sadness to these nurseries. The children were often pale, sickly, and prone to the vapors. They didn't run. Teysa fled. They didn't shout. They whispered. They were the products of a system that valued the purity of their blood over the strength of their bones. The infant mortality rate in the Habsburg family was staggeringly high, even by the standards of the time. For every Charles II who survived to adulthood, there were dozens of siblings who flickered out in infancy, their little bodies simply too tired from the genetic weight they carried. The toys they played with were equally stifling. They had silver rattles and gold-leafed rocking horses, but the joy was sucked out by the constant supervision. Imagine trying to have fun while 6 elderly men in black robes watch you to make sure your jaw doesn't lock. The irony was that while the Habsburgs were trying to breed, they were actually breeding a generation of children who were exhausted before they even reached puberty. They were sad, sickly, and spoiled, a collection of tiny, gilded tragedies waiting for their turn to sit on the throne they were too tired to hold. Chapter 15. The cabinet of dusty curiosities, when your jaw makes it hard to talk to people, and your genetic makeup makes you feel like a wilted piece of celery. You tend to find comfort in objects. The Habsburgs didn't just collect land. They were perhaps history's most dedicated hoarders of the bizarre. This was the era of the Kunstkammer, or cabinet of curiosities. Imagine a room that looks like the attic of a wizard who has lost his mind and also has an unlimited budget. They filled these rooms with everything from unicorn horns, which were definitely just narwhal tusks, to mechanical clocks that performed tiny, depressing plays every hour on the hour.
Emperor Rudolph II was the gold medalist in this particular event. Rudolph lived in Prague, and he was, to put it gently, not a fan of people. He had the classic Habsburg melancholy as sort of deep. Spiritual blah, and he dealt with it by ignoring his empire and staring at a collection of shrunken heads and celestial globes. He was a man who would rather spend 4 hours discussing the properties of a magic stone with an alchemist than 4 minutes discussing a looming war with his generals. Because why wouldn't you favor a rock over a war? Rocks don't talk back, and they don't have chins that require special tailoring. The irony here is that while the Habsburgs were physically deteriorating, their collections were becoming the most sophisticated in the world. They were surrounded by the finest art, the rarest minerals, and the most complex machinery, all while they themselves struggled to digest a soft-boiled egg. There was a peculiar contrast between the high intellect of their collections and the low energy of their lives. Rudolph eventually became so obsessed with his treasures that he refused to leave his palace at all. He created a world of still objects where he could feel safe from the terrifying, fast-moving reality of a changing Europe. It was a slow, quiet withdrawal into a museum of his own making. Chapter 16. The Silent Meal of the Sun King's Neighbors. If we float away from the cluttered rooms of Prague and back toward the stiff formality of the Spanish court, we find that the boringness of the Habsburgs had a very specific rhythm. This was the era of the grand covert, the public dining ritual. Now, you'd think a king eating would be a private affair, but for the Habsburgs, it was a spectator sport. The king would sit alone at a massive table, while rows of courtiers watched him eat in total silence. Because of the jaw situation, this was essentially an hour of a man struggling with his food while 50 people in wigs pretended not to notice. The silence was absolute. No one was allowed to speak unless the king spoke first. And since the king usually had his mouth full of a very complicated piece of pheasant, he didn't say much. 2. The only sound was the clinking of silver and the occasional rustle of a heavy silk sleeve. It was a masterpiece of awkwardness. They were performing power by showing how much patience they had for boredom. The Habsburgs were the masters of the long pause. They would stare at a painting for 20 minutes without blinking, or sit in a carriage for hours without saying a word to their traveling companions. This commitment to the monotone life was a defense mechanism. If you don't move too fast, your joints don't ache as much. If you don't talk too much, no one notices your speech impediment. They turned their physical limitations into a style of majestic gravity. To be a Habsburg was to be a statue that occasionally had to go to the bathroom. They lived in a world of velvet, incense, and very, very slow clocks. As the dynasty began to fade, the palaces became quieter, the ceremonies became longer, and the gap between the rulers and the real world became a vast, silent canyon filled with nothing but the dust of their ancestors' portraits. Chapter 17. The king who played tag with the state lets float away from the heavy, jutting jaws of the Spanish court and drift north toward the chilly, windswept halls of 18th century Denmark. Here we find King Christian VII, a man who was essentially the human personification of boredom turned into a fever dream. Christian became king at the age of 16, which is a stressful age for anyone, particular for a boy who had been raised by a tutor so strict that the poor kid was practically vibrating with anxiety. By the time he took the throne, Christian had decided that if the world was going to be a giant, formal drag, he was going to make it as weird as possible. The tone of Christian's court was one of sustained awkwardness. He didn't want to discuss tax reforms or naval treaties. He wanted to play, but not normal, kingly games like hunting or chess. No, Christian preferred to spend his afternoons leaping over the furniture and playing high-stakes games of tag with his courtiers. Imagine being a dignified diplomat, draped in medals and heavy brocade, trying to discuss the grain trade while the King of Denmark is literally crawling between your legs or hiding under a sideboard. Because why not turn the highest office in the land into a middle school recess? It was a slow-motion collapse of dignity, one somersault at a time. Christian's mental health was, to put it gently, a bit of a localized disaster. He suffered from what was likely a form of schizophrenia, but at the time, people just thought he was whimsical or difficult. He would occasionally walk through the streets of Copenhagen at night, smashing windows with a mace just to see what would happen. Then, he'd return to the palace and expect everyone to act like it was a perfectly normal Tuesday. The irony of his reign was that while he was technically an absolute monarch, he had absolutely no interest in ruling. He once said that he had been born to be a commoner, and he spent his entire life trying to prove himself right by avoiding every single responsibility that came his way. Chapter 18. The Doctor and the Queen's Silent Revolt. Because Christian was essentially a child in a man's velvet suit, a power vacuum opened up at the heart of the Danish court. And into that vacuum stepped Johann Friedrich Struensee, the king's personal physician. Now, Struensee was a man of the Enlightenment. He liked science, he liked reform, and he liked the fact that the king was too busy throwing pillows at the palace guards to notice that a doctor was suddenly running the country. This led to one of the most bizarrely quiet coups in European history. While Christian was off in a corner talking to his imaginary friends, Struensee was busy issuing over 2,000 decrees in less than 2 years.
Winter was also emotionally heavy. Medieval life already lacked modern distractions. No artificial light meant long nights. Darkness came early and stayed. People slept more, not because they were well rested, but because there was nothing else to do. Depression, though not named as such, was common. Chronic melancholy, lethargy. A sense that time had slowed to a crawl. Religious belief both helped and didn't. Winter was framed as a test. Endure now, be rewarded later. This was comforting, unless you were cold, hungry, and watching your child weaken. Then it was harder to find meaning in frozen mud. Children suffered most. Small bodies lost heat quickly. Food shortages hit them first. Childhood mortality spiked in winter. Many didn't make it to spring. Parents knew this. They watched carefully, helplessly. There was no extra food to give, no warm rooms to move them to. You did what you could, which often wasn't enough. Animals suffered too. Livestock had to be fed from stored hay and grain. If supplies ran low, hard choices were made. Animals were slaughtered early, or left to die. A failed winter didn't just kill people, it ruined the next year. No animals meant no plowing, no manure, no recovery. And then there were the winters that went wrong. The long ones, the wet ones, the ones where the snow didn't melt until late spring. These winters caused famines. Entire regions weakened at once. When spring planting failed because people were too weak or seed grain had been eaten, disaster followed, all because winter overstayed its welcome. Medieval chronicles talk about winters the way modern people talk about natural disasters. The winter was harsh. The cold was unrelenting. Many perished. They didn't need to explain. Everyone knew. Winter was the quiet reaper. No announcement. No drama. Just absence. Absence of warmth. Absence of food. Absence of strength. And yet, people endured. Year after year. They prepared. They stored. They hoped. Winter shaped medieval life more than any king or war. It decided who lived long enough to matter, who inherited land, who had children, who vanished from records entirely. Chapter 2. The slow mathematics of starvation. Winter didn't arrive alone. It brought numbers with it. Quiet, relentless numbers that medieval people carried around in their heads without ever writing them down. How much grain is left? How many mouths are still eating? How many weeks until spring, assuming spring remembers to show up this year? These calculations were never spoken out loud, because saying them made them feel more real. But everyone was doing them anyway. Food scarcity in winter wasn't a sudden cliff. It was a slope, a long, gentle decline that felt manageable at first. In November, things were usually fine. The harvest had just come in. Barns were full. Bread was still reasonably white. Spirits were decent. People told themselves that this winter wouldn't be so bad. They always did. By December, the optimism thinned. The days shortened. Meals became smaller, though no one called attention to it. A little less bread, more porridge, less meat. Stews grew watery. The flavor was still there, technically, but it had to work harder. Nobody complained openly. Complaining burned energy, and energy was expensive. January was where the math started to hurt. Winter's midpoint was psychological torture. You were halfway through, but it felt endless. Food stores were no longer theoretical. You could see them shrinking. Grain bins visibly lower. Salted meat hanging thinner on the hooks. Cheese wheels getting smaller and more precious. Every meal came with a faint sense of guilt, as if eating today might steal from tomorrow. This was when rationing truly began. Not organized written-down rationing, just quiet adjustments. Children were encouraged to sleep more. Elderly relatives suddenly lost their appetite, or at least pretended to. Meals were stretched with fillers. Bread flour was cut with whatever could be ground into something resembling food. Acorns, peas, weeds, sometimes bark, if things were truly grim. And the body noticed. Hunger in winter was different from hunger in summer. In summer, you could imagine food. In winter, food felt far away. The cold amplified everything. Hunger felt sharper, more personal. The body burned calories just to stay warm, so you were losing ground even while eating. People became thinner in a way that wasn't fashionable or poetic. Cheeks hollowed. Eyes sank. Strength faded quietly. For peasants, winter hunger was expected. It was baked into life. Bad winters happened often enough that people had language for them. The hungry gap. The weeks before spring when stores ran low and fields offered nothing. If a family survived enough winters, it felt like an accomplishment. If they didn't, it was tragic but not surprising. But winter didn't respect class. Nobles ate better, yes, but they were still at the mercy of supply chains that moved at the speed of a cart and a horse. If a road was blocked or a river froze, food didn't arrive. Castles could starve just as surely as cottages. Sometimes more so, because castles were full of people who expected to be fed. Royal households had massive winter stores, but they also had massive mouths, servants and guards. Courtiers, guests who arrived and refused to leave. Hospitality was a social obligation, even in winter, which was deeply inconvenient. Turning someone away could start a feud. Feeding them might start a famine. This is where the irony crept in. Medieval elites often starved politely. Meals were still served in courses. Plates were still arranged, but portions shrank. Meat was padded with bread. Sauces were thin. Everyone pretended not to notice. To acknowledge scarcity was to admit weakness, and weakness was not a good look for people claiming divine favor. Kings especially were expected to eat well, even when supplies dwindled. A thin king looked like a failing king, so food was diverted toward the top, which meant someone else went without. Winter hunger was hierarchical. It moved downward. The lower you were, the colder and hungrier it felt. Famine, when it came, didn't explode. It seeped. First came price increases. Grain costs more, then bread got smaller. Then bread disappeared. People sold possessions to buy food, tools, clothing, land. Eventually, they sold themselves into service, or debt, or worse. Winter famine rearranged societies quietly, without ceremony. And famine-fed disease, malnourished bodies don't fight well. Immune systems falter. Small infections become fatal. Cuts fester, coughs deepen. Winter illnesses weren't dramatic plagues, but they were constant. A low, grinding mortality that thinned communities year after year. Children were especially vulnerable. Winter hunger affected them first and longest. Growth stalled. Bones weakened. Some children survived winter only to die in early spring, when their bodies simply couldn't recover. Medieval parents understood this pattern. They dreaded spring not just for planting, but for funerals. Pregnant women faced brutal odds. Winter pregnancies were dangerous. Calorie shortages, cold stress, and illness all stacked the deck. Miscarriages were common. Complicated births were more likely, and giving birth in an unheated room with cold water and numb hands was a quiet nightmare no one romanticized. Now let's drift briefly toward the psychological side of winter hunger. Hunger changes people. It narrows the world. Long-term planning fades. Kindness becomes harder, not because people are cruel, but because they are tired. Medieval moral codes emphasized charity, but winter tested that deeply. How much could you give when you weren't sure you'd survive? Communal bonds strained. Villages argued over resources. Lords argued with tenants. Churches urged patience and faith. Sometimes that helped. Sometimes it didn't. Winter hunger was fertile ground for resentment, superstition, and quiet despair. Religious fasting, which was common, became deeply awkward in winter. The church calendar didn't care about food availability. Fasting days piled onto already meager diets. People complied outwardly. Inwardly, they negotiated. Rules bent. Exceptions multiplied. Survival quietly overruled theology. There were also coping mechanisms. Alcohol consumption often increased in winter, not because people were partying, but because beer and ale were calories you could drink. Weak ale was safer than water and provided some energy. It didn't solve hunger, but it dulled it. Slightly. Stories helped too. Long winter nights were filled with repetitive tales, prayers, and songs. Not for entertainment, exactly, but for distraction. Anything to make the hours pass without thinking about food. Time itself felt heavier in winter. Every day was something to endure. And then there was the fear of running out completely. That moment haunted people. When the last sack of grain was opened, when the last animal was slaughtered, when you realized that everything left was meant to last weeks, not days. This fear didn't scream. It sat quietly in the corner of the mind. Some winters were remembered forever, not because of snowstorms or blizzards, but because of absence. Absence of bread, absence of warmth, absence of children who should have grown up. Chronicles recorded these winters with restrained horror. Many suffered, great hunger followed. That was all that needed to be said. Winter taught medieval people a harsh lesson in limits. No amount of prayer or status could create food where none existed. Preparation mattered. Geography mattered. And sometimes, none of it was enough. Chapter trace sickness, silence, and the indoor world. By the time winter settled in fully, medieval life moved indoors. Not indoors in the modern sense of warmth and comfort, but indoors as a last resort. Walls closed in, doors stayed shut. Air grew stale. The world shrank to a few rooms, a fire that never felt big enough, and the same faces, day after day, all breathing the same exhausted breath. Winter sickness didn't arrive dramatically. It seeped into households the way cold did. Slowly, quietly. A cough here, a fever there. Someone complaining of aches that never quite went away. In a world already underfed and overworked, winter illnesses didn't need to be aggressive. The body was already halfway to losing. Respiratory problems were everywhere. Smoke from hearth fires filled rooms constantly. Chimneys, when they existed at all, were inefficient. The result was air thick with soot and irritation. Lungs took a beating all winter long. People coughed as a matter of course. Chronic bronchitis wasn't a diagnosis, it was just life. Now add cold to that. Cold air inflamed lungs further. Damp clothing pressed against skin for days. People slept fully clothed, sometimes in shoes, to preserve warmth. Moisture trapped against the body led to chills that never resolved. Pneumonia followed quietly. A person would weaken over days or weeks. Then one night, they simply wouldn't wake up. Fevers were common, mysterious, and terrifying in their own subdued way. Medieval medicine had no concept of viruses or bacteria. A fever was seen as an imbalance. Too much heat or too much cold. Treatments reflected this confusion. Bloodletting was still popular, because of course it was. Nothing says this will help like removing what little strength someone has left. Herbal remedies were used when available, but winter limited options. Fresh plants were scarce. Dried herbs lost potency. Some worked. Mani, the line between medicine and superstition blurred entirely in winter, when desperation was high and choices were few. Infectious diseases spread more easily in winter, not because they were seasonal in the modern sense, but because people were crowded together. Families slept in the same rooms, sometimes in the same beds. Privacy was a luxury that winter did not allow. If one person got sick, everyone noticed, and often everyone followed. Children, once again, bore the brunt. Their immune systems were weaker. Their bodies lost heat faster. A simple winter cough could turn fatal in days. Parents watched helplessly, trying to warm small hands, whispering prayers, bargaining with whatever.